More than 50,000 Russian citizens had a temporary or permanent residence permit in Latvia in 2022. The former Soviet Union countries had well-established active commerce and bilateral tourism with each other. But after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of the sovereign territory of Ukraine by the Russian troops, the Latvian authorities started actively fighting the Moscow influence. What Riga has already managed to do and what still obstructs the movement of the state away from the imperial influence of the Russian Federation, watching our movie The Occupation, The Latvian Path. In August 2022, the Cabinet of Ministers of Latvia decided that one may get a permanent resident permit only after passing an exam in the Latvian language. And current documents for citizens of the Russian Federation will become invalid and must be updated. All those who do not obtain an official residence permit must leave the country, in some cases even forcibly. That means that just one thing is enough to stay in Latvia: to pass the state language exam. After all, it is illogical to live in the state for more than 30 years and not know its language. But this is exactly the logic of people with imperialistic views. It's unacceptable for a representative of the metropolis to learn the language of a colony. Certainly, not everybody finds the new legislation comfortable. Many have not signed up for the exam or apply for permanent residence permit renewal, so they will soon receive documents demanding that they leave the country.
Вопрос языка.
Right after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, the issue of language became influential. And indeed, there appeared a demand voiced by the Latvian nation for finally having those norms and principles complied with, and for the status of the Latvian language here to correspond to the status of the only state language. Well, it is in principle for this purpose that some more specific, we can say more rigid norms of the law were adopted, although observing quite well, let's say, the framework of universal human rights at the same time. But I would say that all this has finally reached some adequate condition.
Russia has been an aggressive country for ages. I repeat, we would like to live next to Russia, which is democratic and peaceful and engaging. We never seen such Russia in the past. It has never been in the past. It's of course not now, and most likely we should be ready that it will never be like this. So this imperialistic DNS, this imperialistic part of Russian society as well, it's not just Putin's Russia, it's also Russia's Putin. So that's why we should be ready for different kind of scenarios, and they our own national military defense capacities, our cooperation, a strong presence of NATO is instrumental. I mean, we are experiencing hybrid warfare on our border all the time.
Yeah, and several waves of occupation, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you look in the past, if you look what's happening right now, what's happening in Ukraine, so there is absolute neglect for human life, both human life of your opponent and of course human life of your own people, respectively, in Russia. So that's why we should be ready for all negative scenarios as well.
We actually made a lot of efforts in different institutions to enforce the use of Latvian language, the state language. There's been a lot of, not only in the public sector, but in the private sector, that automatically, if you go to in the restaurant, me myself, I had, cases where I go into the restaurant, I sit down, and comes the waiter or waitress, gives me a menu and asks in Russian, do you want something? Or hello, здравствуйте. And I'm stunned. Obviously, I corrected, why do you address me in Russian language? So this is something that I would call right now that we have somewhat awakening on these matters. We ask for more on the use of state language, strengthen the use in ordinary, everyday, activities, but it takes time. Knowing that heavily we had, different policies that, unfortunately, due to differences in political leadership, we didn't introduce the education only in the state language. I mean, for 30 years we had got dual system that has, what we see right now, made a lot of mistakes that are costly right now to correct. But it doesn't mean that we have to, take our arms down. No, it's actually, let's make an additional effort to strengthen. Just now, today, we submitted the legislation, the labor law, in which we will prohibit the employees to ask for Russian language. Because that's been identified as a huge issue for the younger generation.
Должна была произойти Буча и Ирпень.
Bucha, Irpin, and Mariupol were to take place for my compatriots to also finally feel that this is not so innocent. With the approach, well, we feel so comfortable with you, everything is so nice here, so let us live here, that is what it used to be like. Well, live here, but pay. And they were deep-pocketed enough to pay. Well, and as you understand it very well, the ability to pay stimulates a lot of other things, because of which a sort of ambiguous attitude could be tolerated. Since, say, let's be frank, not many of them were openly rude, and it was all rather well-oiled. Well, no, certainly you are a sovereign state, but it's not obligatory to learn Latvian. One can do without that, it's possible. But this "it's possible" is gradually fading away.
Я думаю, чтобы долго бы еще никто к этому не обратился.
I think no one would have addressed the laws, language, otherwise for still quite a long period. I know plenty of people who have been living here all their lives long, and they know Latvian, and they live here perfectly well, but I have never seen them burst into tears or be concerned about the fact that they feel devastated because of this. I have never seen such a thing in my life. Now the people who are getting a residence permit have to pass the language exam. Maybe that is done for the sake of driving away the people who are reluctant to get integrated into Latvia. Maybe that is because the new law has been adopted. There are some exaggerations. Why shall an old lady who is 18 years old take an exam? She has grandchildren who will speak. Today, one should make some effort to stay in this country. One should pass an exam. I know people who pass it, but I have not them in sweat while learning the language.
Right now is obviously a lot of speculation. Look, it's going to divide the society and so on. No, we do respect minorities. It's not only the Russian minority we have. Well, we have, Tajiks, we have, from Central Asia, we have Ukrainians, we have Belarusians, we have Jews as well. And there is a law and also a convention that is binding to us to provide information in minority languages. The Russian concept that they are using, spreading their disinformation, as saying this Ruskoязычный, there's no such thing. Either you're ethnic Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, or other ethnicity. There are no language minorities. There are minority languages, not language minority. And this has been a tool for Russia for years. The Ruski Mir concept that they have spread through the Russian language across the world, not only in Latvia, in Europe. And this is something that the West, is right now confronting. Maybe we have done much more than the rest of the Europe. The rest of the Europe is awakening right now. The pink glasses they had on Russian language, that is spreading culture, diversity, and etc. No, it spreads terror and suffering. That is what is unfortunately the language being used.
Я им говорю достаточно часто.
I tell them quite often, after your citizens of the Russian Federation have attacked a sovereign Ukrainian state with weapons in their hands, please don't teach your laws to anyone. And moreover, don't teach Latvia and Latvians in general how we should be building democracy here, in Riga, in Latvia, in our motherland. They have come here to speculate on our achievements. They feel very comfortable here. Here we have observances of human rights in place. We have safety, rights, we have respect for people here. The law of personal data protection. There are many great things here. We have excellent medicine, not ideal, but excellent. I can compare it with the much praised Russian medicine. They are just speculating. It is perfectly obvious to me and easy for me to explain to them that their behavior is unacceptable. I ask them, what have you built in your own home country? Now the whole world has seen it and has been terrified. Therefore, here the only thing you are entitled to is to keep silent about your grandeur. Forget about it, just reformat your conscience and help Ukraine.
Угроза существует, и за этим следят наши.
The threat is there, and our competent authorities are monitoring the situation. By the way, if you ask whether they identify themselves as Latvians, here in Latvia, by Latvians we mean ethnic Latvians, that is, the ones for whom Latvian is their native tongue and who identify themselves with the Latvian nation, Latvian ethnos, Latvian people. Ukraine is now playing role of a sort of indicator, since the treatment of what is happening in Ukraine constitutes a litmus paper for our monitoring public institutions. I mean, the statements made to justify the Russian aggression, all the more justifying and denying military crimes that are criminally punishable in Latvia. And that also serves right away as the indicator for us and a warning signal showing that this person can potentially be disloyal to the Republic of Latvia as well.
You know, other people coming here buying the residence permit to acquire some real estate, those people contain a very strong threat of imperialism in them. They treat everything from the following standpoint. We are great, our culture is great, our ballet is great, our piano players are great, and our theater is great. And each time it seemed funny to me, and I laughed and told them, what is so great? Where is your grandeur, even if you used to have it one day? How is it that your citizens, the citizens of the Russian Federation who were brought up in the Soviet schools with the great culture of youth, how could they take machine guns into their hands? How did it happen that they went to kill the neighboring nation, sovereign Ukraine? How can they press the buttons on their missiles, their bombs, and all of these monstrous things? What are they doing? Where is your great culture? Where is your great education? They have, in fact, cancelled it all out themselves. And those coming here saying we're against Putin, we're against war, they remain imperial. However, just not towards Ukraine, but towards Latvia. I know it from Latvians, both from my husband and other citizens living here, that respect for the Latvian nation as much stands for the respect of the Latvian language, since the nation, the Latvian nation itself, did not have the same territory for more than 1,000 years historically. They did not have one common religion. The Latvian nation is based on the Latvian language, and it's useless to pretend that you are a full-fledged resident of Latvia if you do not speak Latvian, if you don't understand Latvian, and don't use it daily. And that's what those relocated people do not do. Their narrative is, I am against Putin, but it definitely does not yet mean that they are for Latvia, that they respect Latvians as a nation, that they respect the Republic of Latvia as a sovereign state. This is the same thing, but in the comfortable conditions, on a cozy European sofa.
My dissertation, master thesis, was on the Ruski Mir concept, the Russian foreign policy, and how they instrumentalize it to invade other countries, to influence other countries. And it's very evident, and it's, you know, there's a zillion of evidence that that's being an excuse to invade independent countries. We see it with Georgia. Before that, it's even, you know, it goes all the way even back to the Chechnya as well. And I think the international community has realized that this is being used as a weapon The minority in Latvia, as I said, it's not just Russian minority. Ethnic Russians in Latvia account for 10% from our population. That's exaggerating when, they are putting this Russian-speaking population, which is, there is no such minority Russian-speaking population, which accounts to 30–35%. Obviously, this being used as a rhetoric, but then again, the Russian citizens that we have, and this is something that we are now addressing as well as an issue, the presence of Russian citizens in Latvia due to the ill-famous scheme. If you buy real estate at that time, very cheap, $50,000 give you could even buy a garage. You get temporary resident permit, which allows you to travel across Europe, work in Europe, and etc. And that's been used by more than 50,000 Russian citizens with different, walkings of the life. And now we see that Russia is using this sometimes as an excuse, but we make the case on surveys as well. What is the temperature in these parts of societies in Latvia? Yes, there are, as I mentioned, in Riga, in Daugavpils, in Latgale region in particular. When you talk to the people in Latgale, particularly their attitudes towards Russia, you see, yes, they're somewhat nostalgic. In Soviet times, that's the elder generation, not the young generation. No, there's no illusion what is Russian. But again, when it comes, to voting, it's the elder generation who's the active one. Like the last Russian, presidential elections, we saw 96% of Russians who legally reside in Latvia voted for Putin. So that also gives you a conclusion where the value base they stand. So they support what Putin is, doing, what Russia is doing. But when you ask another very important question, do you see Latvia as a part of the Russian Federation? No way. No way. That is a no-go. That's not even an option. No. I'm not crossing that line. No, I'm not interested. But when it comes to, this, sorry for using a lot of Russian words, but this is the lexicon that, the Russian elite regime is using, Держава and so on. We are, the rightful, you are the subjects of us. Your destiny depends on us. And this has been, widespread right now across Russia, but, I would say not anymore in Latvia. Somebody might be very skeptical of what we have done so far. I think we are the only EU member state that has banned all the propaganda channels. Somebody will debate, yes, but everything is accessible on internet. Yeah, but that complicates. That means you have to search for that and so on. The elder generation is not that keen on modern technology. They used to, sit down in the evening, turn on the telly, and just, I'm ready to be brainwashed. So this option is not there anymore.
Мои отношения можно определить словами китайского философа.
My attitude can be characterized by the words of a Chinese philosopher of the pre-Christian era. He said, "The world has sunk into lies and I have nothing to talk with it about." And that is what we see. I think definitely they are lying in the West. That is absolutely clear. Just a few minutes ago, a man was speaking and he called the Western civilization the civilization of jackals. On TV, on the internet, he meant something by saying this. He used to live in Latvia, then he moved to Germany and went back to Russia. And now he reaffirms the Chinese statement. I'm frustrated by the government fighting the Russian language. That is so silly.
It is exactly these Russian worlds that the Baltic states are afraid of. Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia consider that from 1940 till the proclamation and gaining of independence in 1990, they used to be under the Soviet occupation. At that time, the Kremlin was trying to rewrite the history of the country so that the culture of those peoples was not developing in any substantial way. That is exactly why, when the opportunity appeared to restore independence, armed protests broke out in the capitals of the Baltic states. In January 1991, 2021 in Riga, the events known as the Time of the Barricades took place, during which a building of the Ministry of the Interior Affairs was attacked. As a result of clashes between the Latvian and Soviet authorities, 6 people were killed, some were wounded or beaten. Several days before that, in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, the Soviet army attacked the TV tower and 15 people were killed as the result. Those events showed once again the lust of the Moscow rulers for blood, and that was repeated, though on much larger scale, in 2008 in Georgia and 2014 and now in Ukraine. Russia has shown once again with its wars what its actions are in case of its disagreements with the geopolitical movements of the neighboring states towards Europe and the Western world. That is why accession to NATO came to be an important step towards the country's security. At the same time, the alliance does not eradicate the likelihood of any new aggression.
And for them, losing that is probably the biggest fear. Also, there was I think a few months ago, exposure of the leaked plans from Kremlin, how to create influence in a number of countries. There were Baltics, Belarus, Moldova, and others. And also in one of those plans that referred to the Baltics, we were the threat to their plans. So actually, why I'm kind of raising that is the more you are able to function and fight in this cognitive battlefield, or the battlefields of minds, the more it is deterrence for them doing something in your kind of backyard. And that is, I think, an interesting thought, because once again, what is Article 5? It's also a cognitive battle. The deterrence is to shape the decision-making of the ones that would want to attack, to want to take over, but how to make sure that they don't want.
And I think we should have an investigative committee on actually understanding what is Russia's footprint still in Latvia. You know, sleeping agents, not agents, useful idiots, I would call them as well. So to see the overall picture. But the deoccupation it's not only a physical process, it's a mental process. You know, to tear down those, you know, connections, it takes time. And it's still, even though, you know, 30 years and now next year is 20 years since we are a member of EU and NATO, the living standards are uncomparable with the living standards in Russia. Still have people saying, you know, better times than Soviet times. But that is a dying out generation. Well, with the younger generation, you don't see such things.
For instance, my grandson has already registered. He will come of age of 18 in March, and he has already registered for the 9-month service or something like that. My friend says it is not something frightful, but it's still dangerous. Well, dangerous if war begins, everyone will anyway be conscripted, right? Everyone, am I right? So I also say one should defend one's own country no matter what happens, am I right? Suppose someone attacks Latvia, Latvia will not attack Russia, but if someone attacks Latvia, we need to protect our country. And me and my daughter wanted him to go to military college right after the 9th grade.
Latvia is strongly mobilizing international community to stop the Russia's attempts to you know, do the history revision as well, trivializing and etc. They are doing that, and it's not only Russia. I mean, there are, I call it the axis of evil. We see they are forming in front of us. We see the ambitious China as well. We see autocratic countries, Syria, for that instance, Iran, and they are joining hands.
My friends on social media applauded when our authorities, I mean the Latvian authorities, passed a decision together with the Estonian, Lithuanian and Finnish authorities to no longer allow Russian cars to enter our territories. All my friends on social media were saying, "Hurrah, finally!" And there was not a single critical remark made concerning that issue.
And just imagine how difficult it is, as an Ukrainian refugee, how difficult it is to leave everything and to go away. The same thing there. How difficult it was for people who was the stars, who had money, had their own houses, cars, friends, their own life, to leave everything there and move to Latvia when they are told, go and take an exams. And don't talk that much. And generally, just step aside, we don't understand your Russian. Do you think they feel fine about that? They find it extremely difficult. I don't compare it with Ukraine, they are staying under shell in there. Nothing to generally talk about there. These are definitely the affected people, unfairly affected with none of their fault. Nothing to talk about. But these ones feel bad as well.
They were fleeing from, as they say, the breakdown of their businesses. Well, first of all, the European sanctions are working, slowly but steadily. They were escaping from the fact that they could no longer rent out their apartments for such a huge amount of money. I'm talking about Muscovites, for such a huge amount of money as they used to rent them out before, because they had been renting them out to foreigners. Now, foreign business has left Russia. Well, it's roughly for reasons like this. In any case, there are very few people that fled from the fact that they could be imprisoned. Just a few.
Restrictions and inconveniences faced by Russian citizens in any country that considers itself an ally of Ukraine are inevitable. And this is what is called the responsibility of a citizen for the actions of their country. This exists and has always existed, and in more distant times these principles worked much more rigidly. I mean, now we hear some talks about a possible blockade of Russia. Let's say 100 years ago, with such a situation as we have now, a blockade of Russia by European countries would have been, I would say, a matter taken for granted. And Russophobia is in fact dislike of and respective actions against all Russians. Well, Latvia is a good example. There is no persecution of Russians as an ethnic group. Russians are not deprived of their rights as citizens of Latvia. If they have such rights, if they are citizens, no one makes such a suggestion because someone is Russian, even if he puts that ill-fated inscription, "I am Russian," on his car, even if he covers himself with St. George ribbons from bottom to top. He will be fined for this, but he will not be deprived of the citizenship of the Republic of Latvia, if he is a citizen.
Within any etiquette, a guest has no right at all to tell the host what to do in his house.
Latvians are people whose main credo in life is make yourself at home, but don't forget that you are a guest. We always follow this rule when we come to any country. Like when I went to Russia, for example, I always treated this country with respect. And that was because I came as a guest. I'm a guest. And I want my country to be treated the same way. People who come here, this blogger, he should respect us if he comes here. If he doesn't come here, let him shut up. That's what we can tell.
And those people who have arrived, they behave in such a way as if they came, so we must give them those rights, which, as a matter of fact, our democracy, European countries, have all been building for themselves, for their citizens. And naturally, our government will think about the security of our countries. And in conditions of war, and I know that Latvians feel uncomfortable about the arrival of Russians, Latvians remember the Soviet occupation very well. My older relatives have been living in Latvia for a long time, and when these people recall the Soviet regime, they cry since they have very serious traumas. And by the way, here is one of the reasons why, just my version, why the Latvian society is helping Ukrainian refugees so carefully and so actively. You know, Latvians, when in 1944 they were fleeing from those liberators who also came to Latvia by tanks, Latvians also became refugees in European countries, in the USA, in Canada, in South America, and those people, the local population, accepted them, helped them, arranged their lives there, and I have a feeling that that's why Latvians are now wholeheartedly helping Ukrainian refugees. It's a bit like a repayment of such karmic debt may be taking place.
For us as a nation state, our country was founded on three ingredients: language, territory, and our culture. That is the establishment of statehood in 1918. So we have to maintain that, not to dissolve into the overall multicultural way. We praise diversity. We do praise. That's why we have almost more than 10 minority groups in Latvia, and that enriches us. But there are things that still need to be overcome. I think this is a great proposal right now is from our new president, is to restore the amount of history being taught in schools.
I once saw I wasn't infected with imperialism when I was moving abroad. I moved to a country clearly understanding its history, knowing how hard it had been for Latvians and what they had experienced throughout the occupation. Here, in the Me and Latvia case, everything was perfect. I am ashamed to say this, but subconsciously I retained a specific attitude to say the representatives of the Caucasus. I could drop an inadequate phrase. For example, I could listen to an anecdote told to me with the Caucasian accent deliberately and could be indignant enough to say that I did not want to listen to it. This means that I was surprised that my own tolerance was not well developed in all its aspects. And when I realized that a long time ago, I started controlling myself. So, am I a civilized person in this, or do I have some Soviet grain in me? If I have it, I will pull it out of me and transform myself, and that means working on yourselves. It was easy. It wasn't long, since the main thing is to understand it. You will agree that if a person realizes that this is his or her shortcoming, it is very easy to eradicate it.
It is such a complex perception of things, which I believe very often includes a dislike of democracy as such. Democracy is not a comfortable system in terms of responsibility. What democracy cannot in any way offer to the citizens of a democratic country is the absence of responsibility for the fate of the country and society. And this is a burden people are willing to do a lot about to get rid of it. I think that many people are even ready, so to speak, to give their fatherland, their lives, and their fate into the hands of the Tsar, just not to feel this burden of responsibility, not only on their own shoulders, but also on the shoulders of their families and society as a whole. That's one thing. There are quite a lot of people who have some specific grudges against Latvia, which was built after the restoration of independence. Some people were not very lucky in some economic matters with their social status. They transformed into, say, the director of an enterprise, but he became not a very rich person. One may even say that a poor pensioner. So the changes were rather profound. The whole economic system changed. Many people could not adapt to it. This led to resentment towards life in general, and specifically towards this society, this state, and to the idea that it used to be better, and maybe in subordination to Russia as well. You know, this phenomenon of maybe it would not be so bad under Russia. It was present even during the first period of independence, as historians tell us and write about. Russia might have seemed, it's true, much earlier, before February 24th of 2022, such a alluring country with wider opportunities and more resources. Not everything there is so rigidly regulated as in Europe.
But despite the willingness of some residents of Latvia to become closer to Moscow, most Latvians advocate the independence of the country. And the establishment of own state came as an important factor here between World War I and World War II. That period was the great importance for the Baltic states since it was back then that the economy and, most important, their own state was developed with no Russian communist pressure, unlike in Ukraine.
The main difference is really about the heritage that was present all the time in the form of books available in almost every home, in the form of pre-war publications, magazines, newspapers that were kept and reread, in the form of silver coins that were used to make jewelry. They even sometimes allowed themselves to wear them in public and so on. There was no difference between a Riga intellectual and a peasant, owner of some hamlet located 100 or 150 kilometers from Riga, since there was a bookcase with collections of works by Latvian and not only Latvian classical writers at that hamlet. A piano could quite often be found there, people were interested in culture, people used to sing in choirs, play in ensembles, perform in theaters, go to theaters, something like that. Well, in general, this is also a characteristic of the Latvian society of that time. There were a lot of small landowners. It was a consequence of our agrarian reform in the 20s. Such peasant farms were managed by practically only a family, one family. They did not fall under this characterization of kulaks. So they were the masses that were formed, Latvian collective farmers. But even to those collective farms, they managed to bring in their laboriousness, their ability to still somehow do their business, to do well, and to even cope with some often stupid norms of the Soviet planning and other things. Well, yes, that was it. That was it that allowed us to preserve this feeling for 50 years, together with very high immigration, which supported the relevance of this idea there in the West. That is also so important. This doesn't mean that the Soviet system did not leave for us a lot of unpleasant heritage, which we're also gradually getting rid of either. In the mindset, in terms of responsibility for the destiny of society as a whole, some logic of political decisions and actions. The way our parties are formed is very problematic. They still very often have the characteristics of hobby clubs, societies that exist for the sake of getting power and using it, certainly within some limits. Again, it's very good that the European Union exists, since it already makes many things impossible and problematic. But we cannot put ourselves 3 steps above Ukraine. We cannot deliver lectures to you in this regard. We can only give you a little bit, maybe a little bit of advice on how to deal with these problems. Although, on the other hand, maybe the advice is more useful than the one you can be given by those who have never had such problems or used to face them a long time ago.
My niece, when asked by me all of a sudden, she's more than 20 years old now, "Do you know who Lenin is?" And she said no. Here's the answer. They don't know that history. They rewrite it the way they want. They don't want to know all this. That's why it seems to me that, as far as Latvia is concerned, if we are not implanted, our way will not be that long. That's why let everything be fine in Latvia. Let them not be concerned. The main thing, stay out of us. That is the main thing.
For several years, Putin and Russian authorities have been talking about geopolitical fields of influence. We cannot tell it for sure where the fields of influence ends according to the opinions of the aggressor state residents. That is why the fights with possible occupation, in terms of power, culture, or just language, now constitutes a very important task for all the countries bordering Russia. Since it's very difficult to predict where the Kremlin troops will decide to protect the Russian-speaking residents. That is why the neighbors are now taking pains to move as far as possible from Moscow and to deoccupy their residents from the Soviet heritage and influence. How this is done in other countries? Watch our next project series.